Hello, this is Vinnie Emery, and I'm here to talk about providing trauma-informed care and learning how to care for ourselves as trauma stewards. This is a component of the recovery coaches in the emergency department training. So before we get started, I want to take this moment to acknowledge that right now we're living through a pandemic, and that in itself is trauma. On top of that, there is a lot going on in the world and in our country right now that is traumatic in itself and might heighten our sense of safety and touch on our own trauma. So with that, I want to read through these things that might be some truths for us as we are in this moment. So parts of our brain have shut down in order for us to survive. As a result, we're not fully able to process a lot of what is going on around us. We might be feeling somewhat numb and out of touch with our emotions, and that's normal, especially if you have lived through trauma before. Some people are more apt to feel hypervigilant or anxious, while others become hypoactive or depressed. Neither of those things means anything other than indicating your predisposition to dealing with extreme stress. In-depth processing of trauma happens years later when we're fully emotionally safe to deal with it. While in the midst of trauma, just getting by emotionally and functionally is okay. Lowering expectations and being kind to yourselves and others is vital. And that's important for me to share because I know that a lot of you have recently been through recovery coach training or about to embark on another training and are learning this stuff about trauma. It's a lot of information to take in. So just encourage you to be kind to yourself. And with the videos, you can pause and take breaks as you need. They're not too long, but still important to just take care of yourself and tend to your needs, drink water, eat snacks, stretch, move, all of those things. I always encourage that. So let's take a look at what is trauma. So when we say trauma, what are we even talking about? Trauma is when we have encountered an out of control or frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love. That is a quote from Tara Brach. A traumatic event can involve a single experience or enduring repeated events that completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. Traumatizing events can take a serious emotional toll on those involved, even if the event did not cause physical damage. This can have a profound impact on the individual's identity, resulting in negative effects in the mind, body, soul, and spirit. So these are all, in this image too, to the right, it says under it, trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. And these are some of the symptoms that come up. It does not mean you don't have any memories of trauma, but a lot of memories might come back in nightmares or flashbacks, or you might just lose memory at all. But these are all of these things on the slide here. I'll read some of them in a second, but those are symptoms of trauma. But it's just important to acknowledge that trauma also is something that can happen, as it says, a single experience or something that happened over a long period of time. And that form of PTSD is called complex PTSD. There's lots of different kinds of trauma. We'll look into that a little bit. But I do want to acknowledge that there's not a greater or less than trauma. There's different kinds of trauma. They're all really valid. And the way that people experience events, one event can be traumatic to someone and not be traumatic to someone else. And that is okay too. So here are some types of trauma. There is bullying, community violence, like gang violence or war or terrorism. Um, Police violence is one that's not on there but would be in there. Complex trauma, which I just mentioned, which is exposure to multiple traumas, sometimes long-term. Disasters, like earthquakes or tsunamis, floods, early childhood trauma, intimate partner violence, medical trauma, physical abuse, refugee trauma, sexual abuse, terrorism and violence, traumatic grief, race-based trauma, and intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma, just to touch on that really quick, because it might be a new word for some of you, that it means that it's trauma that might not directly happen to somebody, but is passed down through their generation. So if, so in the slide that we just looked at, when we looked at all of the sort of symptoms of trauma, those behaviors, because you're like, say that your mother might have been traumatized and all of her behaviors in reaction to that trauma, if gone untreated, can then pass that trauma down to you. And so it's just trauma that is passed down. So there can be indirect trauma in that way. So some components to trauma. So regardless of the source of what the trauma is, so what we were just talking about in the last slide, is that there are these three kind of common elements, which are that it was unexpected, that the person to whom the trauma happened was unprepared for that trauma, and that there is nothing that that person can do to stop it from happening. Simply put, traumatic events are beyond a person's control. It's not the event that determines whether something is traumatic to someone, but the individual's experience of the event and the meaning that they make of it. I'm going to pause for a second because I want to take that in. I said a different version of that a little bit ago, but it's important. I'm going to repeat it one more time. It's not the event that determines whether something is traumatic to someone, but the individual's experience of the event and the meaning they make of it. So these are some impacts of trauma. So these are some ways that trauma might show up in your life, or someone that you're caring for, or someone that you love. You might feel the inability to feel safe. That might have feelings of anger or mistrust. It can show up in chronic pain, like fibromyalgia and migraines are really common side effects of trauma. Having an out-of-body feeling, which is also called dissociation. Always feeling like you're on edge, really irritable. Nightmares or flashbacks, and self-harm or substance use. So as this is a training to work with substance use disorder, it's important to acknowledge also that trauma and substance use disorder often go hand in hand. Certainly not everyone with substance use disorder has experienced trauma, but it is very common. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of what trauma is, let's take a look at what it means to be trauma-informed. So trauma-informed care acknowledges that many of us have had traumatic experiences that shape our life. The goal of trauma-informed care is to promote safety and healing and to avoid re-traumatization. So that really means that when we are working with someone that is experiencing or has experiencing trauma, we're being so mindful of the way that we interact with them and the way that we speak and the way that we present, that we are doing our best to avoid our actions causing re-traumatization. So here are some ways that can help. One is to be educated in the prevalence and nature of trauma. Another is to act with compassion and with skillfulness. To actively create a culture where it's safer to listen to the body and share emotions and desires. To embrace the transformative power and strength of vulnerability and triggers, and to create space for checking in and feedback and growing together. So ultimately, you know, when we first meet someone, say in the emergency department, we're not quite there yet where we can do a lot of doing a lot of feedback and growing and stuff, but we are at a place where we are introducing ourselves to them as being someone who is safe and that they can trust, and little by little, working with them, they will grow with us, and hopefully will feel safe enough that they can give us feedback about our services and how we are helping them, or if something that we're doing is not feeling right to them. That's a big ask and harder to do in a short period of time. So a big part of what we're doing is to minimize the chance that our behaviors are re-traumatizing. So it's that like gentleness, the awareness of our tone and of our body language, of the kind of language that we use, and making sure we are not coming with any assumptions or putting anything on them, really letting them be in control and lead the conversation. So we have 3 images here, these beautiful flower images that I'm going to actually read directly from because I find them so helpful. These are all examples of what we might see when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about re-traumatizing, and when we're talking about trauma-informed responding. So with trauma, someone might experience having control taken away from them, feeling unsafe physically and emotionally, experiencing a loss of trust in the good of people, having to tell your story and experiencing stigmatization of not being believed, the use of forceful interactions or abusive language. So someone might be experiencing that in the emergency department when you see them. They might have been bringing that experience of their life with them, and that really might inform about how they want to or don't want to interact with you. So some kind of things that can be re-traumatizing is not giving the patient choices in treatment or testing, which that won't happen so much with us, but happens in the hospital, and is also, but it does speak to us thinking about multiple pathways to recovery and how we're promoting multiple pathways. That's a big choice thing where people are able to make decisions and feel empowered. I always say that if you don't know your options, then you don't have any. So being part of that system that gives choices instead of just doing to someone is really avoiding that re-traumatizing and promoting empowerment. So some other things that might be re-traumatizing is failing to provide full attention and care, failing to ensure safety and privacy, controlling, so believing that you know better than the patient, being judgmental with your language or labeling or making assumptions. Again, they might be experiencing this at the hospital, and you'll learn more in the training about how we address that and how we best can protect our participants from that kind of harm. And talking over, interrupting, or talking down to patients. that can be really re-traumatizing and harmful. So some ways that we can respond that are trauma informed are to give control back, allow patient to make decisions, trust that they know their body best, provide safety and provide privacy, allow support people to be with the patient, to be transparent and communicative, allow the patient to take the lead in discussion about medical decisions, to believe them, do not require disclosure to provide trauma-informed care, and ask for consent. Create a plan with the patient and not for the patient. Although our program is, as I mentioned in our introduction video, that it's mostly an opt-out. That means someone isn't asking you to come to them. We are part of the hospital care team for substance use disorder. It's important in our introduction that we let them know that it's their decision whether they work with us or not. That we give them that control right from the beginning. So we encourage that to be part of your introduction elevator speech, and you'll be able to work on that at the training. So this image is called the window of presence, and it really talks about at different parts of our brain, and I won't get into the anatomy talk right now to save us time, but there's different parts of our brain that feed our responses to a situation. And so we're looking at these kind of three places where someone might be in a high arousal place, which is known as a fight or flight, or at a low arousal place, which is a freeze, and inside a window of presence. So when you're in the window of presence, this is an emotional and physical experience that we can tolerate with what's going on, or without going into like upset or flip out or shut down. When we're in this range, we can instantly, we're in this range of intensity, we can stay present, grounded, orientated in the space and time, and able to think and feel and communicate. Our nervous system does not like hijack our consciousness and threat response like fight or freeze or flight does. So this really means that even though stressful things might be happening around us, that we're able to like really just be present and aware. So this is something to be mindful of for yourself and for the people you're working with yourself, because again, we're working in this high stress environment. You might experience these things. You can be any place of these things, because it's likely that at some point in this job you get triggered, or things you'll have a emotional, physical response to what's going on. But knowing, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. We're going to talk about how we care for ourselves in that. So this information that we're looking at now is really good information to have about ourselves, and also to have about people that we might be working with. And it just lets us know like kind of where they're at. And so if people are at these top two places, in a high arousal, a fight or flight, or a low arousal, a freeze, they're not really in a place where they can maybe engage in motivational interviewing, for example. They might have to like regulate themselves before they're able to do that. Or we, coming into the hospital, if we're feeling any of these things, or during our visit, might have to regulate ourselves before we meet with the client, or, take a bathroom break to help regulate ourselves, to like get ourselves back into the side of this window of presence. And the window of presence is really where you're able to engage and learn and process. So some of the emotional signs of being inside the window of presence is being orientated to like where you're at. You're able to think and feel at the same time. Your emotions are available, but you know, you can keep them contained. You're not like being in an upset or physically displaying like your emotions in big ways. Inside you, your heart and breath rates feel great. You're able to move. You're able to sit still when you're supposed to sit still. You can just feel comfortable, like in your body. You might like feel things that are like, that like, you might feel a sense of anxiety, but you're able to like, it kind of tolerate it and it stays chill. And then, you know, if we're feeling really high arousal, that's like what anxiety, like high anxiety you or someone you're working with, often this will be the other person in the emergency department. But if you're being like, you might experience if you're having an altercation with someone, but you know, they're scared, they're distracted, they're angry, defensive, flipping out, their heartbeat, they might be jittery, their heart's like beating really fast, they're twitchy or shaky, or can't stand still. That also might, both of these things, the low arousal and high arousal, also might be because we're often meeting folks, as I said, who might be inebriated or withdrawal. These might be signs of that as well. So a low arousal is where we're numb, we're feeling hopeless or helpless. There's a lot of fear, shame, and we're just really stuck in that. You're spaced out, you really can't focus. Everything is low, your heart rate is low, you're like not, maybe like holding your breath or not breathing. You're really tired and shut down, just like not attached to your body at all. So these two places like when within ourselves and with others really give us some information about how we interact with someone, when we're really gonna have like an ability to like do the motivational interviewing, do the things that we're trained in, will be inside of the window of presence. And these other places, the high arousal and low arousal, are totally normal and okay places. They're uncomfortable for other people. And it's just important at that point, if someone's like really in those places, it's not our job. We're recovery coaches, where it's not our job to fix or change where they are. We're able to like sit there and remain calm and just remember that we can only control ourselves, our own behaviors. But professionally, our job is to not help them work through their panic or anger in a way that is not safe for us or them. So it might mean that we sit quietly or like and wait for them, or just be a calming presence, and sometimes that helps. Sometimes it's like, do you want me to come back later, or do you want me to just leave my information? Can I leave this information and give you a call tomorrow? But those are some signs of what it might look like and kind of decisions you might have to make around that. So here's some definitions of trauma exposure response. And so why we are looking at this and talking about this is because when we're working with people who are experiencing trauma, especially when we're doing a lot, we're like every day or frequently going to the emergency department, we will have exposure to other people's trauma. We're more susceptible to these kind of trauma exposure responses when we have also experienced trauma, and because we often are people with substance use disorder, working with people having trauma having to do with substance use disorder, that can be really triggering. And so it's important to be aware of like how that can show up in our lives and how we can take care of ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the job, because we might like eventually have some negative experiences from this. It's not damaging or harmful if we can stay engaged ourselves, stay true to ourselves, and take care of ourselves and be really mindful of what these exposure responses look like. So vicarious trauma is cumulative transformative effect upon a professional who's working with survivors of traumatic life events. Compassion fatigue is the emotional residue of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. And then there's secondary trauma, which is the emotional and psychological effects experienced through vicarious exposure to the details of traumatic experiences of others. So what all of these are saying is that there are ways that trauma can show up in our own bodies that sort of look at like the window of tolerance that I was just explaining, where we ourselves can become dysregulated and so have like phases of hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So now that we know what trauma can look like, what kind of our response to trauma exposure could look like, I'm going to, wrap up this presentation in just a few slides, but I'm going to note too is that I'm providing some worksheets for you to do along with this video or after this video that will really help get you started at looking at how we can care for ourselves and how we can know ourselves in trauma and in working with people with trauma. And thinking about what kind of things resource us. That means, so when I say what resources us, what I'm asking is, when you're feeling drained, what fills you up? When you're feeling heightened, what helps to ground you? And an important thing to think about, and something that's been on my mind a lot recently, is that we talk a lot about self-care, and self-care is so important, and I am not going to downplay self-care, but some things that I want to mention with self-care is that the onus of care should not just be on one person, and that's why it's important to have community. And some people have a lot more access to community than other people. Some people have families. Some people have close friends. Some people have church or recovery centers. So there's this access of when we're thinking about how we take care of ourselves or how we ask for care to others, is just to be mindful. And I'm just saying this to be mindful because I don't want to assume that everybody has the same abilities to care for themselves or the same resources to care for themselves or to care for others or to ask others to care for them. But I do want to be mindful of the importance of finding that balance wherever we can, of finding the balance of how we can resource ourselves, and then finding that comfort or stepping outside our comfort zone, asking other people for help. And so doing those worksheets are a really important job, I think, a part of this job, because you'll definitely experience exposures to trauma, and you'll definitely experience times where it feels like too much. And so doing that work now is really important. It's also amazing work to do, an amazing gift for yourself as a person. And I think the world would be a nicer, more peaceful place if we all were encouraged to spend more time thinking about how we can care for ourselves and others, and how to feel comfortable asking others for help, and really to say that you are not less than or weaker when asking for help. And I think that most of us, I don't want to speak for everybody, but it's my experience in talking with people is that most people feel pretty good when somebody asks them for help and they're saying, hey, I am really overwhelmed. I cannot, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I've noticed you're really good at this. Would you mind giving me some tips, or would you mind just like giving me a ride? Just having someone, even if you have to say no, and that's its other practice, being able to say no, but just knowing that people might rely on you can give people a really good sense of themselves, a sense of belonging and a sense of being wanted. And so I invite people to think about that when they think about asking for help and when they feel bad about asking for help. And if it feels any better, I always encourage people to tell people when they ask for help, it's okay to say no. I totally get it if you're not available, but if you are, could you do this for me? And that's another way that making these plans can be really supportive for you in the long term, so that you're not, often when we're in the moment, when we're feeling all of these really hard things, when we're feeling shame or guilt or exhausted, or we just can't do anymore, it's hard for us to remember what resources us. So doing these worksheets that will accompany this training will be really helpful. And then you can have that on hand. And so when you're feeling that way and you're like, I don't know what to do, and this is hopeless, you can revisit those sheets and be like, wait a minute, I have a plan for when I'm feeling this way, and take a look back at them. I also want to mention that a lot of the ways that self-care is promoted to us here in our country is in form of like in a really capitalistic form, meaning like even if you're a capitalist, like that's okay. This is not like not a political statement. It's just really saying that the idea of self-care is promoted to us as something that we spend money on, that we have to go to the spa or buy these things or buy like a monthly subscription to self-care package or something like that. It gets pretty ridiculous about how far people will go to sell us things. And that's fine if that's what you love. And it's also not accessible to everybody. And it gets very expensive. And then it becomes not self-care, because then you're depleting yourself financially and stressed out that way. And it's creating a whole other cycle. So just to be mindful and creating a list. You'll do this in the homework, and I also just encourage you to just jot down. One thing that I like to do is to create a list of 10 things that I can do under 10 minutes to resource me. So like just some self-care acts under 10 minutes. That could be playing Candy Crush. It could be taking a walk or playing guitar, or it's just sometimes one of the things on my list of that is just allowing myself to zone out and space out. All of those things are acts of self-care. So yes, the pampery things are great when we can get them. They're not always available to us, but just because those big fancy things aren't available to us doesn't mean that we can't have creative ways to take care and resource ourselves. So do please take time with those worksheets that will be shared with you to look through, answer the questions, and come up with those ideas. You'll be really grateful for it in the long run, for sure. I think they're fun to do anyway, but I know like when you're in this job after 6 months, you'll be like, oh, I'm really glad I did this thing. Because now I'm feeling that way. So this is a little quip about trauma stewardship that I like to share, because I use that word a lot, so I just wanted to be clear about what I'm talking about. So it refers to the entire conversation about how we come to do this work and how we're impacted by our work, and how we subsequently make sense and learn from our experiences. By talking about the trauma in terms of stewardship, remember that we're being entrusted with people's stories and their very lives. We understand that this is an honor as well as a tremendous responsibility, and that we're required to develop and maintain a long-term strategy for ourselves such that we can remain whole and helpful to others, even amidst their greatest challenges. So eventually I want everyone, including myself, to be able to say, I'm taking care of myself for myself. And that's beautiful. And if you can do that, I love that for you. And sometimes it helps to frame it in order of like, when we take care of ourselves, we can show up for other people. We can show up for our kids, our partners, our work. We can show up for our participants best when we're taking care of ourselves. So taking care of ourselves and allowing other people to help us is doing our job, is helping other people, is being a good trauma steward. So on that, I will leave us with this one last quote from Susan Raffo. And she says, self-care is the constant practice of not letting more pain accumulate. It's about continually remembering that our lives are of great value. It is the active process of setting our nervous system so that we have more access to the present moment. So thank you for sitting with me today and learning about trauma and being a trauma steward. This is a vital part of the work that we do as recovery coaches in the emergency department. Remember to do those worksheets and have a really great training. Take good care.